Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Ashley Miller. I'm the New Hampshire State Archivist. This is Kristen Keniston. She is the State Registrar, and we both work within the Secretary of State Department. Tonight we're going to be making hot water cake. I'm going to cover the history of this sweet treat we'll be making, and then Kristen will tell us a little bit more about how we came upon this recipe. We'll try to keep the presentation brief so we can have our cake and eat it too. Thank you for laughing at my joke. So hot water cake has been referred to as depression cake, war cake, and wacky cake. There were various periods of widespread poverty and scarcity of goods during which families faced significant financial constraints. Ingredients like milk, eggs, and butter were either too expensive or in short supply. So inventive and creative recipes were necessary to meet one's needs. Hot water cake recipes, the earliest one I found dates back to the 1870s, and I'm going to talk about why. During the Great Depression, milk shortages and lack of financial resources forced consumers to work with whatever ingredients they could scrounge together. And in the two world wars, resources were regulated by the federal government to put towards the war effort. So we'll be diving a bit more into that. I found some varying recipes, and they're all based on the region, taste, and availability of goods. Again, the earliest recipe I found was from 1878, but I also found ones from 1894, 1914, and then several from the Depression era. So there were economic panics nationwide in 1873, 1893, and 1907. Like today, New York City was the center of the financial system for our country. Between 1863 and 1913, 8 banking panics occurred in the money center of Manhattan. The panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907 spread throughout the nation. These panics caused widespread unemployment and economic instability for years to come following each of the events. In the Roaring '20s, milk was 35 cents or so per gallon. But when the Great Depression hit in 1929, fewer people could afford milk, and dairy farmers still had a lot of milk to sell. The price dropped from 35 cents per gallon to 26 cents per gallon, which doesn't sound like much, but in today's money is around $1.09. There had already been farm product strikes in New York, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The Depression stretched on. Dairy farmers started keeping fewer cows and producing less milk. The farmers also went on milk strikes, dumping their milk rather than selling it at low prices, demanding the government's help in raising the prices. By 1935, efforts had paid off and milk prices were up again. And then we get to the World Wars. On August 10, 1917, shortly after the U.S. entered the war, the U.S. Food Administration was established to manage the wartime supply, conservation, distribution, and transportation of food. In order to provide U.S. troops and allies with sustenance required to maintain their strength and vitality, posters urging citizens to reduce their personal consumption of meat, wheat, fats, and sugar were plastered throughout communities. Slogans such as "Food will win the war" compelled people to avoid wasting precious groceries and encouraged them to eat a multitude of fresh fruits and vegetables, which were too difficult to transport overseas. Likewise, promotions such as Meatless Tuesdays and Wheatless Wednesdays implored Americans to voluntarily modify their eating habits in order to increase shipments to the soldiers defending our freedom. Soon after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and America's subsequent entrance into World War II, it became apparent that voluntary conservation efforts on the home front was not enough to suffice this time around. Restrictions on imported foods, limitations on the transportation of goods due to a shortage of rubber tires, and a diversion of agricultural harvest to soldiers overseas all contributed to the U.S. government's decision to ration certain essential items. On January 30th, 1942, the Emergency Price Control Act granted the Office of Price Administration the authority to set price limits and ration food and other commodities in order to discourage hoarding and ensure the equitable distribution of scarce resources. By the spring, Americans were unable to purchase sugar without government-issued food coupons. Vouchers for coffee were introduced that November. And then by March of 1943, meat, cheese, fats, canned fish, and other processed foods were added to a list of ration provisions. Oh, and canned milk. So the relevance today. This recipe and recipes like that promote a lack of food waste. And while researching this topic, I actually came across the hot milk cake recipe. I had opened a new tab on MSN and boom, there's a recipe for hot milk cake, probably based on my searches. However, the caption of it is, hot milk cake is the perfect way to use up the gallon in the fridge. And we're seeing more and more recipes that use up food scraps with the increased cost of living, and resources that were used up during COVID and increased prices as a result of that. We're seeing more and more recipes on things like TikTok and Instagram Reels that are encouraging people to use food scraps. So Kristen's now going to talk to you about what an amazing genealogical tool family recipes are for connecting with your past.
Okay. We'll trade spots.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to show you a lot of family pictures. This is a family recipe that you're going to be doing tonight with us. It's a Depression-era recipe that my great-grandmother Hazel has passed down to us. So I'm just going to show a little bit about my family. So this is the Wright family. They're from Charlestown, New Hampshire. They can actually trace their lineage back to Andover, Massachusetts. And we have a little tie to the Salem witch trials, which is kind of interesting. So the earliest Wright that we have that came over was the very beginning of the 1600s. His son, I believe his name was John, married into the Wardwell family. And the Wardwells had 4 people who were accused of witchcraft, including my grandmother. Her name was Mercy. And the father, Samuel, was the one that unfortunately ended up, he was one of the first men to actually, or the only men to be executed during the Salem witch trials. And they also traced their lineage through the Smiths, which was my great-great-grandmother in the photo with the 2 boys and the horse. The Smiths were actually the first settlers of Chesterfield, New Hampshire, which is kind of interesting. So they were in Charlestown. They were there. I think they moved to the area the very beginning of 1900s, but they were there by 1905. And they bought a farm in Charlestown. I'm actually only about a 10-minute ride from my house. I live just over the border in Claremont, New Hampshire. And so I was able to find their farmhouse that they purchased, and they lived there for quite a few years and unfortunately had to sell it in 1927. Nothing to do with the Great Depression. It was actually a divorce. So he had to sell the property. And then they ended up moving to Claremont. So the gentleman holding the whiskey bottle, which I can only assume is maybe during Prohibition. There's no dates, unfortunately, on these, but he is proudly displaying his whiskey bottle. That is my great-grandfather, Lester. And then this is going to be Hazel. So this is the woman he married, Hazel Clokey. Hazel is from Mount Holly, Vermont. Her family was from Canada. They were French-Canadian by origin. Her maiden last name, and I did not take French, so I'm not going to say this very well, but their name technically was Cloutier, but it was somehow anglicized to being Clokey. And so that was her name. Her father's name was Archie. I cannot pronounce his actual name in French, so I apologize for that. And his wife's name was Minnie Little, which I thought was a very cute name. But her last name had also been anglicized. She was actually Minnie Petite, was her name. So, and she was not a petite woman, which made it even kind of funnier. But this is just pictures of their life on their farm growing up. So they had a dairy farm. It wasn't a dairy farm where they were actually selling their milk. This would have been just a dairy farm that they were using more for themselves and their extended family. There were 11 children in this family, and my great-grandmother was number 7 out of all of them. Her mother passed away shortly after the youngest was born. I think she died in 1925 or 1926. So my great-great-grandfather was raising 11 children pretty much by himself with the help of his older children, which was quite a bit. So they had to get very creative with their recipes and making the most out of everything that they have. I believe that the hot water cake recipe probably originally used milk because they had milk on hand. So somewhere along the line, in the 1930s, I'm thinking it was 1934, my grandmother Hazel and my grandfather Lester, these are my great-grandparents rather, they both started working at a dairy farm in Cavendish, Vermont. And that's where they met. And they ended up getting married. They were married on April 20th, 1935, and my grandfather was born on May 6th, 1935. So as a funny story, my great-grandmother never told anybody what her anniversary was. I think she was ashamed of that. And then I come along many, many years later, and I'm born on April 20th. So every year she got reminded of her anniversary, and we were all celebrating April 20th, and she's sitting there going, oh no. But they eventually had my grandfather, who is the young man in the pictures, and he married my grandmother, Barbara. I'm going to show you some pictures there. So that's my grandfather and my grandmother, Barbara. And Barbara also made this recipe. So while my great-grandmother was the one who had this recipe, I remember my grandmother more as the one who actually was the one making it. So I have a lot of fond memories of watching her make it. And the fudge frosting recipe that is excellent on this, if you can get it right, it's very difficult to make. It's just, she made it perfectly. So this is just pictures of my family, my grandparents, my mother and I, and then my daughter. My daughter's holding a meatball. So the reason we're having this with baking history is to talk about why it is so important that we pass down recipes. So Barbara's family, they're Italian. So we were taught how to make meatballs and lasagna and things like that. I can still make all of her recipes. So the importance of learning these recipes and being able to make them, I was teaching my daughter. As a side note too, as far as the special connection with this recipe. I'm having a hard time talking about this because I'm actually a little emotional. So my great-grandmother Hazel, I was fortunate enough that she lived 2 doors up from me as a kid growing up. And every summer I would get to walk up to her house and she'd watch me during the day. And we'd spend the day cooking together. And she would tell me all kinds of stories about growing up on her farm in Vermont with all of her siblings. And she is the reason I got into genealogy. I have her family Bible, which is what got me started. I was 17 when she passed away, and I had the presence of mind at 17, which surprises me now, to actually keep her family Bible because it's from the 1800s and it records a lot of my family history in it. So that's, if you ever do want to get into genealogy, make sure you're hanging on to these treasures because that's how you learn all this information. So genealogy through food, we make connections, memories, we pass down traditions when we pass down our recipes. You can easily access old emotions like I'm doing just talking about it. And the first time I bit into this cake, I just made it recently myself. I actually teared up because I remembered being a child. It just brings back great memories. And you can make these recipes anytime you want to feel that. It keeps a legacy of our relatives and loved ones alive. And cooking recipes from our heritage can bring a sense of togetherness that spans over generations. So anytime you're cooking a family recipe, whether it's the hot water cake or the meatballs, it brings back that special connection to our heritage. So we won't go through the whole recipe, but it's a very simplistic recipe. So this was Hazel's hot water cake recipe, and there are recipe cards out in the other room. And this was my grandmother Barbara, and that was her fudge frosting recipe. And as I said, this woman can make fudge. And one of the lessons she taught me was never make fudge when it's humid. So when I tried it on Sunday, it was a very humid day. My fudge frosting did not come out well. I can tell you, I didn't listen to her and I should have. So this is a trivet that actually was hung in my grandmother's kitchen, my great-grandmother's kitchen. It says, "Kiss and don't last, cook and do." I actually have that in my kitchen myself because it always brings me back to standing and watching her cook. And I have it out in the other room on display. My recommendations, if you're going to try to make this recipe at home, is butter your pan, use good butter it and get it nice and greased up, and then put a little dusting of flour on it. Just to fit our modern baking dishes, I would double the recipe. I made it at home and it was only that thick. So if you want a nice fluffy one, which is what I kind of recall it being when I was a kid, I would double it if you're going to do this. And if you can't make fudge like I can't make fudge, you can use confectioner's sugar or fresh fruit to top it or any frosting that you want. And that concludes our presentation.
So now we're gonna get baking.
Yes.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, for being in this awesome, amazing space. We're very fortunate in Bow to have the library offering our meeting spaces and cafe space. This is the first time that we've utilized the cafe space in this way. So this is very exciting for us. Like Kristen said, I'm actually going to be mimicking a lot of what Kristen says because I dealt with the same issues that she did when making this cake, literally probably 5 hours ago. So we are going to start. Does everyone have the recipe in front of them that they can kind of review? So this is very few ingredients. We're gonna have 2 eggs, ½ teaspoon of vanilla, 1 cup of sugar, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 cup of hot water, and 1 cup of flour. Most of us already have those ingredients in our kitchens, which is fantastic. I'd actually like to ask you guys by a show of hands, how many have ever made this cake or tasted this cake or grew up with this cake other than
Similar cake.
a similar cake? Was it hot water or hot milk or?
It was water. There were no eggs. There was vinegar in it with baking soda. So that's why they didn't.
So you had that chemical reaction that you would get with the eggs or with other.
And it has a pour-on frosting, which might be easier for everybody.
Yes. Okay, so the first thing that I did, I preheated the oven to 400 degrees. So what we will do, I do not have an electric beater, so I have to just use my muscles. So I will crack 2 eggs. Let me wash my hands first. So when I made the fudge icing, it did not go well, so I do have confectioner's sugar, and that's what we will use tonight. So we will crack the 2 eggs. And then it says in the recipe, 2 well-beaten eggs. So if you have the electric beater, that's where this comes in handy. Otherwise, just pretend you're making scrambled eggs. All right. I'm going to add ½ a teaspoon of vanilla.
Kristen, would you double it and still use an 8x8 grease pan?
I would if I'm double.
Yes.
Still use an 8x8?
Yeah.
Okay.
I will show you why.
We published this recipe before we tried it.
Yeah. All right, and then 1 cup of sugar. So this recipe and the frosting, when I poured the cup of sugar, I thought that seemed like a lot, but it tastes really good. So it's all good. All right, and then 1 teaspoon of baking powder. The nice thing about this is it's all done in one bowl. You don't have like the bowl of the wet ingredients, bowl of the dry ingredients, so it really is a very easy recipe. ½ cup of hot water. So I actually have some water that was boiling. It turned off, so it's still hot. So I'm just going to pour that in here. And you might hear a little sizzle. That's just from the baking powder reacting to the hot water. And then 1 cup of flour. And I used cake flour for my recipe. I don't know if there's a difference with you as far as the all-purpose flour or cake flour.
I think we used all-purpose, so that could be where my mistake was. Maybe it was cake flour they were using.
Okay. Well, mine turned out the same as yours. So. So this is where having the electric beater does come in handy. And actually, Kristen pointed out a really good thing as far as greasing the pan. That's one thing that I remember my grandmother always telling me was the butter. Greasing the pan really well with butter and then adding just a coating of flour. So that's fantastic. All right, so that's really all the ingredients that you need for the cake. I will put this in the oven and then I will talk about the fudge frosting and just how to make it, and then explain how not to make it on a day like today where it's 80 degrees and very humid. All right, so that looks good. Again, it's the consistency that you would normally have a cake batter. And then you pour it in the pan. I'm going to make sure we scrape all of this in. And this is an 8-inch round pan. And I would definitely agree with Kristen. We're so used to having thick cakes to double this recipe. You will have to double the time, I'm assuming, too, because it did cook really quickly. It only takes 15 to 20 minutes. And when I made this recipe, I had 3 cakes in the oven at the same time, and they were all done within 20 minutes. So if you do decide to double the recipe, just make sure to add the extra timing. Okay, so easy as that. Could you put a timer on for 20? Or yeah, thank you, because I will forget. So this is one that has not been decorated yet. This is how thin it came out. So absolutely double the recipe, or if you do 2 of these, you could add a layer of frosting and then put the other one on top and then add a full layer of frosting. So we can talk about fudge frosting, and I might actually have you contribute anything that you would like to add, Kristen. So you need 1 cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon of cocoa, a dash of salt, which is really just a pinch of salt, a half cup of milk. I used whole milk for my recipe, a half teaspoon of vanilla, and a dab of butter. And sometimes when you find your old recipes and you see a dab of butter or a dash, you don't know. You're like, what does that mean? I assumed a dab of butter was 1 tablespoon and just kind of called it a day. I kind of did a quick research as far as what other fudge frosting recipes used, and they all were within that 1 tablespoon. So I kind of had to backtrack and do my own research to figure out what a dab means. But you will find that occasionally when you see any cooking or any baking recipes from family history, so much of it was just carried down by word of mouth. So that, or like it was just natural. There was really no recipe. You just kind of did it.
They taught you. You learned the technique, so they
Yes.
didn't need to put it in the recipe because you know this, because this is how everything is cooked.
Yep. So you kind of have to backtrack and be like, okay, how do I figure this out? How do I pass this along in the event that I don't have that experience to share it by word of mouth? So when I created this fudge frosting recipe today, I doubled my batch because I had to cover 2 cakes, and I was stirring for about an hour and a half, waiting for it to thicken up. So what you have to do, you have to prepare the frosting. You have to combine the sugar, the cocoa, the salt, and milk in a saucepan. And what I did, I stirred it all up. I sent it on like a rolling boil for about a minute. And that was just based off of other recipes that I had researched. And then I took it off of the stove and then let it cool down on its own, because hopefully as it cools down, it starts to thicken up, it starts to harden, as you would with fudge when you're making fudge. And one person that I did find their recipe, they recommended to have a thermometer and to have the heat up around like 227 before taking it off the stove. So I definitely recommend that, not on a hot humid day, like Kristen said. So earlier today, I was just stirring and listening to an audiobook, and it was really warm. I walked over to the AC, turned the AC on. I started stirring in front of the AC. And then by about an hour, I was in the freezer. Saucepan was in the freezer, and I was just hanging out in there. It was starting to thicken up at that point, but not worth it on a humid day. So what we have here, I did make this cake that has no topping on it. I do have the two over there if you would like to try them. What happened is it did thicken up to that consistency that we needed. It's almost like a cake batter consistency. But as soon as I poured it on the cakes and it hit the regular temperature of the room, it just kind of soaked right into the cake. So the cakes almost have a sponge-like cake effect with the chocolate kind of drizzled down to the bottom. So what we can do, we can cut the cake and then scoop the glaze, the chocolate glaze, the icing essentially, just drizzle it on top for you if you wanted to try it. It still tastes fantastic. It still has lots of sugar, so it's all good. But another idea for these hot and humid days, so that if you still want to make the cake, but you do not want to put the effort into the frosting, I decided to do the confectioner sugar route, the powdered sugar route. So we have just the basic cake recipe that we started with, and I took just a little bit of powdered sugar, and you just sprinkle it. And actually this plate that I'm using is one that my grandmother passed down to me. Aww. So I felt like it was very appropriate for this evening. So we have the powdered sugar. I decided since strawberries are in season right now, let's do a strawberry theme. So I grabbed fresh strawberries. I have whipped cream. I have lemon curd. If you just do a little bit of lemon curd mixed in, I thought that would be a nice springy taste with the strawberries, and then just a couple pieces of mint. So I'm going to cut a piece of the cake and then show you how you can present it when you are ready to eat it. Let's see. So again, this is a very thin cake. It's very dense as well. So I'm going to add just a little bit of the whipped cream. I'm going to, let's see. I would like to put a dollop of the lemon curd on top. And just cut little slices of the strawberries, however many you'd like. You could also do this all on top of the cake as it is, but just so you can see the presentation. You can arrange it however you'd like. And then fresh mint, just a couple sprigs, and then you have yourself a little piece of cake. So that's a much better presentation than what is the frosting one. So that really concludes the baking. We have samples of the chocolate frosting, and then I can make more samples of this one as well. We'll have plenty for everyone here, and then this cake should be done fairly soon. So we'll have hot, fresh cake to try as well. So does anybody have any questions for either Kristen or myself or Ashley?
This is totally off the subject, but do you know what year your grandparents were married?
So my grandparents, Barbara and Nigel, were married in 1960, And my great grandparents that I had shown you the picture of were 1935. And I will add for the fudge frosting, if you have ever made the Hershey's fudge, where you use a lot of the cocoa powder and you stir it and it takes forever and you do bring it up to temperature. That's the consistency that this frosting is supposed to be. When I made it on Sunday, it just didn't harden, because that's unfortunately anytime I make fudge, it doesn't harden for me. But I can remember as a kid, not only was the cake fluffy, but there was a good thick layer of actual fudge across the top. You could just pick it off and eat the fudge, and it was amazing.
I was gonna say, I was the cake baker in my family, I made a lot of cakes, but the frosting, I just guess at. You know, it's just a guesstimate, it was no real recipe. And I use confectionery sugar to start with, but it's not that difficult. You just kind of mix it up and everything, and it goes on. You know, sometimes it's a little different than others, but you know.
Do you use, I was going to say, do you use measuring tools, or you just use spoons?
Oh,
or
well.
just throw it in
I
there?
mean, I use recipes for things, but not for frosting.
Yeah,
Never
yeah.
for frosting.
Well,
You
you're
know,
gonna try
I
to write that down.
just take a little milk and a little butter, heat it up, add it to the confectionery sugar, then I add a little shortening just to get it a little fluffier. And, you know, depending on what kind, if I have cocoa, I put that in. If I have vanilla, I usually put a little vanilla in it and just stir it. It's not very challenging. And it always comes out okay.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, let me know if you try this fudge frosting. We might need a lesson.
I'll have to try it. But I have made some frostings that you do cook that
Yes.
are different, but I don't usually do that.
So I was just thinking that as I'm looking at this recipe, and when you put it with the strawberries and cream, it's reminding me of a Victoria's sponge. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but my mother-in-law was English, and during the war, of course, they had very little sugar.
Yeah.
So she would try to make a Victoria's sponge with just any old, anything she could find, basically. She would throw in the recipe, and it always seemed to turn out just fine. So.
That's interesting. Very cool.
Are there any interesting recipes or cookbooks in the state archives that you found, Ashley?
So this got started because I was writing, I do monthly articles for the Concord Monitor, which then Mike lovingly turns into videos, which are on the Concord TV YouTube. And I was doing some research on town meeting day and came across a recipe for election cake, which I'm seeing all of the New Englanders in here shaking their heads saying, we've had election day cake, and now I'm very curious, is it good? Have we made it? Have we had it? No.
It's plain.
Oh.
It's plain.
It's plain. We had thought about making it, someone in the department, and I don't think anyone has yet. So
I've got my mother's Fanny Farmer cookbook from 1920 something, which is my apocalypse cookbook, because it tells you how to purify milk and how to, I mean, it's stuff you're gonna need. But that kind of a recipe would definitely be in there.
yeah. Yeah, it was a very plain recipe, you know, similar to this, and then some dried fruits.
It was almost like a fruit cake.
Yeah,
Kind of.
or like a soda bread.
Yeah.
Is how I thought of it. But again, I haven't made it yet, so we'll have to do another one of these around election day.
While I was waiting, I looked up online, hot water cake, and it's exactly like your recipe. It's doubled, but they used cake flour instead of regular flour, so that might give that a go, I don't know.
I usually use cake flour for making, say, plain cake like this, but like, say, Williamsburg orange, you may have had that, has raisins, golden raisins, nuts. I don't think you need the cake flour in that kind of a cake, but in a nice plain cake.
What is the difference? Is it
Well,
having
it's
baking
been
soda?
sifted more, it's been sifted more, or if you were using regular flour, you might cut down a little bit in the
It's got
flour.
different glutens.
Yeah,
There's
it's,
different levels of protein.
yeah.
There's different gluten levels.
And now nobody sifts flour or anything in the past, but I do, or you do. Ah. Okay.
All right, well, I will have Kristen and Ashley, if you want to come up, we can start passing out samples of everything.